Hello and welcome to the Polk Pioneers History Program, a collaboration between the Polk County Historical Association and the Polk County History Center. I'm Myrtis Young, Historic Preservation Manager for the Polk County History Center. Thank you for joining us today as I have the pleasure of interviewing S.L. Frisbie IV, a lifelong resident of Bartow, Polk County for 79 years, who will be sharing personal memories about his life. S.L., thank you for joining us today and sharing your story. And I think we'd like to begin when you began life in Bartow.
Well, thank you. I began life in 1941 at Bartow Memorial Hospital. My family came here, my great-granddad came here in the late 1920s, and in 1931, my grandfather and my parents and I moved to Bartow. No, in 1931, there was no me. My grandfather and parents moved to Bartow, and granddad and great-granddad started the Polk County Democrat in 1931. Dad was in college at that time, Florida Southern College, as was Mother. That's where they met. And so the Polk County Democrat remained in the family for 75 years, which is, it's certainly not a record, but it's a little longer than the average newspaper ownership. As I say, I was born here in 1941, and despite the efforts of my parents to encourage me not to follow them into the newspaper business just because they were afraid that I thought that that was my obligation, the more they tried to get me to look at some other field, the more determined I was to go into the newspaper business. So when I went to Florida State University, I majored in government, which is one of the most important things, arguably the most important thing that newspapers cover. And then after 2 years in the Army, I came back and to Bartow in 1964, went to work at the newspaper. While I was in Tallahassee at Florida State University, I worked for 3 of my 4 years there. I worked at the Tallahassee Democrat, a daily, and so I got my feet wet even before I came back to join the family business.
And you had your family's permission to do that, I guess.
I would assume so.
Talk about the newspaper and the early beginnings of the newspaper in Bartow. It has quite a history.
Yes, indeed. My great-granddad bought the Courier-Informant printing company. Courier-Informant was one of Bartow's first newspapers, and according to my research, it was a daily newspaper for about 4 months, a very small daily newspaper, 9 inches deep and 3 columns wide.
Wow.
And when great-granddad came over, he and his son, Lloyd Frisbie, had been in the newspaper business together off and on for a number of years. So great-granddad bought the Courier-Informant printing company and operated that out on North Broadway, about where the Chamber of Commerce is today. Mm-hmm. The Polk County Record, a daily newspaper which had been in existence for a number of years, bought the Courier-Informant. So when Granddad came over in 1931, he and great-granddad got the itch to start another newspaper. They had worked at a number of them together, and in fact, Granddad had been one of the higher-ups at the Tampa Tribune. They bought the Courier-Informant print shop. The Polk County Record, which is then in existence as daily, bought the newspaper, but great-granddad bought the print shop, and with it the press on which I believe that the CI of the Courier-Informant had been printed, and on which the Democrat was printed from 1931 to 1946. In 1946, we, and I say we advisedly, I was 5 years old at the time, bought the Polk County Record and went to semi-weekly, twice-weekly frequency ourselves. The Polk County Record by then had dropped back to weekly publication, so the Democrat bought the Record and moved into its building in downtown Bartow.
Wow. I understand, because I have insider information, you had an early career, about age 12. You were busy delivering?
Yes, I often say that I started my career as a junior executive trainee in newspaper marketing and delivery services, otherwise known as carrier boy. So yes, I threw papers from a bicycle for a couple of years.
And because I also have a little bit of insider information, it's a very exciting day in about 1950. A fire created a little bit of an excitement downtown.
It was quite exciting. Yes, the Democrat was located at what is still known as the Record Building, but the Polk County Democrat was located and next door to them was Tomlinson Oldsmobile Cadillac dealership. It had been painted with, and back then paints were mostly perhaps all oil-based paints, and it was a cold day, and the paint was not drying very quickly, so the room, as I understand it, the lobby was empty, but somebody set up an oil-burning stove there, and apparently somebody tripped over it. I'm not sure about that part, whether it tripped over it, whether it just spontaneously burst into flame, and somewhere along the line this heater got kicked over and set fire to that building, burned that building to the ground, and yet the Polk County Democrat, which was immediately up against it, was saved by the rather remarkable efforts of Bartow's volunteer fire department back then. We printed that night at the Lake Wales News. It's a trying tradition for most newspapers never to miss an issue, even if it comes out late in the day. So we were printed with the Lake Wales News that night, and the almost unbelievable thing, Lake Wales News was a weekly. The Winter Haven News Chief, a daily, had also had a fire, so they were putting their own paper, the Winter Haven News Chief and the Polk County Democrat, in their weekly print shop.
That is a great story. That is
Yes,
a very
indeed.
interesting story.
Yeah, we were very fortunate. They had a very small amount of smoke and maybe water damage. The building was not usable, probably because the electricity was cut off.
Right. Oh, correct.
Within a couple of days, we were back in business at the record building.
Amazing.
And the auto agency eventually moved out on West Main Street.
Okay, sure. Now, you know, a really, really sweet story from your childhood that I'd love for you to share with us. There was a period of time when you lived with your grandparents.
Yes.
Your dad was busy doing something.
Yes, Dad got a government job in 1944. He was drafted into the Army in 1944 at the age of 29.
Wow.
He was the last pre-Pearl Harbor father to be drafted. Being 29 years old, he was, and I can never remember whether he was the same age as his company commander and older than his battalion commander or vice versa. But at any rate, he was an old man, particularly by that far into the war. The draft was reaching down to younger and younger men. And so Dad, at the age of 29, was drafted into the war, fought at the Battle of the Bulge, had his feet frozen, as did numerous soldiers in that time and place. Spent the rest of the Army in Army hospitals with his feet recovering, and then became part of the Army of Occupation.
Wow. Now, a family of news. Do you remember getting news from your father, letters, or how did you hear about what was going on with him?
Really, I would have been 3 years old when Dad was drafted, and I knew he was my father, and I knew he was gone. I'm not sure that I had a whole lot more awareness of that. During his time in the Army, he was in the Army for 2 years, 1944 to 1946, and Mother and I lived with his parents, my grandparents, on Church Street. And so we grew, my early growing up years were done in my grandparents' home.
SL, I remember reading some really sweet stories about your childhood. One in particular was about a cooling system or your refrigeration system. How did that work?
It worked just like everybody else's in Bartow. Electric refrigerators were virtually unheard of, particularly in homes, and we had an ice box. And in fact, for many, many years, ice box became a euphemism for refrigerators. And a horse-drawn wagon came by from the Bartow Ice Works, I believe that was the name of it, bringing blocks of ice, and the delivery man would chop the big block of ice, put it in the top of your ice box, since obviously cold falls, so that kept the lower part of the ice box cool. And then it was popular with kids, and I cannot remember if we did this at Granddad's house, but I suspect we did. Popular for kids to gather around as the guy was chopping the blocks to gather up the ice chips and chew on them.
Great.
So yes, that's refrigeration was unknown. We did have electric lights. Air conditioning was virtually unknown. So
Sure.
it was pretty basic. Not quite as basic as when the Reading Blunt Party arrived here in 1851, but certainly not what we consider to be our standard of living today.
Well, you mentioned living with your grandparents at this particular time. What was the reason, or why were you living with your grandparents?
I am assuming it was a matter of economics. I never really knew at the time. I just they said we were going to be living with my grandparents, and at 3 years old, I was perfectly willing to accept that. But Mother did, at that time, almost all women were housewives, and the men were the traditional breadwinners. So when Dad was drafted, he couldn't get very far on, I think it was $27 a month to support himself in the Army, as well as his wife and son.
So he's in the Army at this time.
He is in the Army,
Okay.
right, drafted in 1944. I was 3 years old when we moved into grandmother and granddad's house.
So tell us a little bit about his career in the military.
Okay, he was an infantryman. He told me that he was offered a commission. He says it's what they call a cellophane commission. He said it was printed on paper, but you could see right through it. Even though he had graduated at the head of his class at Florida Southern College, he realized he had none of the training or experience to rate his being appointed as a second lieutenant in the Army, so he refused the commission, worked his way all the way up to PFC, which is next to the bottom. Went into combat as combat infantryman. His unit, first day they saw combat was Christmas Eve of 1944. They were ambushed.
Oh, gee.
And then not many weeks after that, his feet were frozen. He said he went back to a battalion aid station thinking they were going to give him a pair of dry socks and send him back up front. And he said the doc told him, said, go back and get your duffel bag. You're heading back to a more sophisticated hospital.
This was a very significant battle.
Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, so after he got out of the hospital, he managed a service club for soldiers and worked a crew of German prisoners of war. By this time, the war was over. The PWs weren't mad at anybody, and in fact, we have some decorations that were made by the PWs to decorate the service club, and I have two small vehicles. One is a model of a Jeep, and one is a model of a cargo truck that his prisoners made for him when they found out that he had a son.
Do you have this still?
I'm sure that I do. I'm not sure how long it would take me to lay my hands on them.
Treasures.
Yes,
Real
indeed.
treasures.
And then his service ended in 1946, and Mother and I went up to Camp Blanding to meet him when he was discharged, and there were probably thousands of soldiers being discharged that day. And Mother and I were there, I still remember where on the main post we were, and looked up, and all of a sudden here comes Dad running top speed to come see us.
Oh, how lovely.
Out of all of these soldiers up there. And I remember I said, Daddy, how did you find us so fast? And he said, son, I was looking real hard. So
I'm sure he was.
yeah, Camp Blanding became my home away from home for 30 years in the Florida National Guard, and it was always had a special place in my heart, knowing that that was where our family was reunited at the end of World War II.
And you know that spot today?
I think so. I think it was on main post near the Post Exchange last time I was up there, and that's been several years. But, I still have a mental picture of where we were standing when Dad came running out of this mass of soldiers to greet his wife and son.
I can only imagine. And you, as a very, very young boy, probably felt that his absence had been quite extended. It's probably felt like a long time.
I assume so. It had become second nature to me. I had known my live-in father for 3 years, and then for 2 years he was gone. So I can't remember what my reaction was, except my surprise at how quickly he was able to find us.
To find you. That was a beautiful day. I like another story from your childhood, when kind of going back to the business, and you all had a particular interest in reporting government, and you accompanied your mother to the courthouse.
Yes, and I don't remember whether this was during the war or she went back home, as did so many wives who came out of housewife chores and went to work. She came back to work, and it was either during the war or very shortly after the war, when I was not yet in school, and I used to accompany her on her news rounds. And that news rounds were made to the Polk County Courthouse, and at that time that was the entire offices of county government.
Correct.
The county commission and all of its offices were there. The county school board headquarters was there. The clerk of the courts, obviously, and the courtrooms, of which there were 2 at that time. and all the miscellaneous, property appraiser, tax assessor, tax collector, even I think the county engineer or county surveyor or some such was there. But all of county government was in that one building, which today, of course, is the Polk County History Center.
Correct. I wonder, as a young boy, did it seem just like a massive building to you? Do you have any memories of just going in there and thoughts of what this felt like?
No, I can't really say that I do. I used to go up on, probably a very few years later than that, I would go up with Dad in the evenings when when he was waiting for a jury to come in a criminal trial.
Oh, wow.
And so I had an exposure to it. I seldom, if ever, actually attended the trials, although I do remember I was there one time when a jury was being chosen in a bootlegging case. And they had the prospective jurors there, the venire, and the judge or clerk, whoever was calling so many of the venire men, I think I've got the term relatively close, to be interviewed, and they call out one name, and one of the defendants raised his hand and says, "That's me." And so the the prosecutor with a straight face then said, "Your Honor, we moved to strike so-and-so for cause," and their defense attorney with an equally straight face says, "Is this going to count as one of his peremptory challenges?" So it was
great memories.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you have those memories. So let's talk about school. You go to school. Where did you begin your education, SL?
Okay, I started out at Bartow Elementary School. At that time, elementary school was grades 1 through 6. There was no public kindergarten. It was at least one private kindergarten, maybe several.
Okay.
But public school at that time was grades 1 through 6. I actually started in the 2nd grade. It's a long story. I was too young to start in the 1st grade when my friends did. I was born on January 15th, and the cutoff date was January 1st, and Mother had worked as a secretary to Vernon Dozier, who is the area supervising principal, which they had then. The person in charge of all the schools in the community was a supervising principal, and she persuaded Mr. Dozier to have me given a reading test and discover that I could read. So I couldn't get into the 1st grade early, but I could enter school a year later in the 2nd grade. So I remember that building well, particularly the tower. The tower is still there, but I think it's probably unused now. And that was where the piano was, and Miss Margaret Clark taught Glee Club in that area. Everything else was in a 2-story building.
Right.
And then I attended junior high school in what was, I think, the 2nd Summerlin Institute building, which was a 2-story junior high, 7th and 8th grades, on just north of the Bartow Elementary School, which is now part of the Bartow Elementary Playground. And then grades 9 through 12, I attended at Summerlin Institute, also today known as Bartow High School.
Correct.
And it was the first year that the new building had been put into use. The new building has been torn down and replaced by another new building, but the brick building on the north end of the high school, which is today called the Summerlin Building to preserve that name, that's where the 9th graders, that's where the freshmen went to class, and only the upperclassmen, or starting with the 10th grade, were allowed to use the new building.
Oh, I see. Well.
And so now the old building still exists. It's been renovated several times and it is beautifully restored. And then the new building was torn down a couple of years ago for a new building to take its place.
Gosh. A lot of educational changes in, well, not just Bartow, but Polk County.
Yes.
Well, you managed to get through that, and then you head off to Tallahassee. Right.
Went to Florida State University for 4 years. And, as I say, worked at the Tallahassee Democrat for 3 of the 4 years. My freshman year, I worked as a student assistant at 75 cents an hour in the FSU News Bureau. And I have confessed that it's the only job where I did not earn the money that they paid me. It was sort of a nothing job, and I did next to nothing. And then at the end of my freshman year, I got a job at the Tallahassee Democrat as an entry-level reporter, and that job paid $1 an hour because the newspaper came under the federal wage hour law, which the college didn't. So I have observed since then that I'm one of the few people who ever left a government job for a newspaper job because it paid more money. So I've stayed there and learned a great deal at the Tallahassee Democrat. We had a very small staff, given that it was the Florida State Capitol newspaper. And as a result of that, I had a chance to work most of the news beats there.
That is great. That is just great. You know, we talked about the fact that your parents wondered if that's the career that you should go in, but I realize as we're talking, that's in your DNA.
It is for a fact.
It's just your DNA. That's just who you are.
And I didn't realize at the time that they were trying so hard to talk me into considering other fields for the sole reason that they didn't want me to feel like it was an expectation, and which, as far as I can remember, I never felt that way. And they later told me they were delighted when I said no, I was going to be a newspaper man.
So then ROTC?
Went through ROTC at that time, 1958, when I was a freshman. All land-grant colleges in the country were required to offer the first 2 years of ROTC, and all freshmen and sophomore males were required to enroll in it. Then if you're interested in pursuing a commission, then you could apply for the second 2 years of ROTC. And in addition to the classroom work, there was a summer camp program there between I think between the junior and senior years, and then on discharge from on graduation from college, we were all commissioned second lieutenants. And Dad told me many, many long years later, he said he was really surprised when I decided to stay in ROTC for that second 2 years. And the fact is, my intent was, well, I knew I had a draft obligation. I figured, well, if I'm going to go into the Army, I'd really rather go as an officer than as an enlisted person. And my intent was to pull my 2-year active Army hitch, spend 3 years in the National Guard, the active National Guard, and 1 year in the inactive National Guard, which was what the draft law required. So after 2 years, I got out of the Army in 1964, joined the National Guard with the intent of staying for 3 years plus a year inactive, and 30 years later I retired. So.
I know, and achieved quite a career and title. You earned the title of?
Well, I was promoted to the rank of colonel.
Yes.
So.
Very nice, very nice. Nation's capital, what are you doing up there?
Okay,
What's going
I spent
on?
my 2-year active Army tour in Washington, D.C., and I was a personnel officer and later assistant adjutant and adjutant in the 116th Intelligence Corps group. As I tell people, I was not a spook. In fact, I used to kid the agents there. I said, you guys are all a bunch of dirty spies. The supply officer and I are the only two honorable officers in the whole organization. But I was there during a very exciting time to be in Washington, D.C., and I can't remember the order in which they occurred, but we were there when President Kennedy was assassinated. And when he was assassinated, I remember the couple of guys came into the orderly room, the orderly room or day room, right next to my office, and said, President Kennedy has been killed. And we said, ah, ha, ha, you know,
Yes.
great joke.
Unbelievable.
And it turned out it was not a joke. And the Army, well, I assume throughout the world, certainly throughout the nation, was ordered to stay in place, because at that time they didn't know whether this was an assassination of the president and nothing more, or the beginning of an attack against the United States.
Oh,
so
my.
they had the Army stay in place for probably 2 or 3 hours, and then when it became apparent that it was not a coordinated attack, they sent the Army home. That's what Washington, D.C. does whenever there's a crisis. They send government employees home, including the Army.
Wow,
and when you send the
interesting.
government employees home in Washington, there's nobody else left.
I'm sure.
So Mary and I lived in southeast Washington and watched on television, our black and white television, our walk-up apartment, as the Air Force One came into Andrews Air Force Base, which was a few miles from where we lived, and watched on TV as the casket was unloaded, and as President Johnson and the newly installed president and the Kennedy family got off of Air Force One. And I believe that it was my impression at the time there were 2 helicopters there, and it was my impression at the time that President Johnson and the rest of the presidential party got on one, and that the President Kennedy's casket and his wife Jackie and his brother Bobby Kennedy got on that helicopter to ride to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the autopsy was performed. I've since read that they were actually transported by ambulance or hearse, but it was definitely my impression that
Right.
that there were the two choppers, one for the presidential party and one for the Kennedy family. And one reason I think that was the case was we watched on TV as the two choppers went airborne, and then looked out the window of our second-story apartment and saw these same two helicopters flying overhead, and it gave you a real eerie sense of participation in the event, or of presence in the event.
Sure enough.
So we were there for that. We were there for the Cuban Missile Crisis when the president ordered a blockade of Cuba against Russian ships which were bringing missiles into Cuba, and which were believed to have the capability of firing as far as Washington, D.C. And I well remember the day that the message came down to go from this security level to this security level.
Yeah.
And a couple of days later, on the day that the Russian ships were going to come up against the blockade, the level went up one more, if I recall correctly. And we were all sitting around in the orderly room. We had a red telephone, just like out of a James Bond movie or something. We were sitting out for waiting for the red telephone to ring, literally to tell us whether we were at war or not, because at that time there was very little instantaneous television coverage. And the phone rang, and it was stand down from DEFCON this to DEFCON that. And we knew that there were two possibilities. One was we were going to go up, which meant we were at war, and the other that we were going to go down, which meant that the immediate crisis was over. So that was, to call it an exciting time is an understatement. And since then, it had become commonly known that the powers that be in government thought that we were on the brink of nuclear war, not just of warfare, but on the brink of nuclear war.
Right.
And the other major event that took place when I was in Washington was the Martin Luther King March on Washington, at which he gave his historic I Have a Dream speech. And the projection, which apparently was more or less fulfilled, it's hard to count 1 million people, but the projection was that there were going to be 1 million people marching or coming on Washington and it was for jobs and I think equal rights in general. And all it would have taken, even though there was no suggestion of any intent for violence, all it would have taken, in my opinion, was for one person, black or white, to pull out a gun or to pull out a knife or to take a swing at somebody, and then you've got 1 million people out there highly strung. The only problem that took place that day was in, I believe it was Arlington, one of the suburbs of Virginia, where a white racist group, American Nazi skinheads, I'm not sure what label they gave themselves, came out to try to mount a counter demonstration, and the police were all over them like white on rice. And there were only, as I recall, a dozen or so people, but they were just determined to go out and cause trouble, and it wouldn't have taken but a dozen people under the right circumstances. And when the day was over, it was like a letdown from tension. I've compared it to a time or two when I've had surgery, and when I'm coming to, I'll say, is that all there is? Is it over? Is my surgery over? Yeah. That's the way people living in Washington felt when the day ended, and the marchers all got on their, mainly on buses, some on trains, some on airplanes, and not a drop of blood had been spilled.
A great relief.
It was, it was just the unbelievable level of tension in Washington, D.C., and turned out it was all for naught.
Those are 3 extremely significant events in history.
Indeed they were.
And you experienced them there, and I can only imagine how glad you were to head home. So
yes, I was. Yeah, that was about as much excitement as I needed for 2 years, and of course I was looking forward to coming home and getting into the family business. And
you did. That's the next stage as you came home?
I was discharged on the 25th of July. Anybody who's been in the Army can tell you the day he went in, the day he was discharged. I went on 26th of July of 1962 and was discharged on 25th of July 1964. And it was a point of pride with me never to have been unemployed. So on the 26th of July, the next day, I went to work at the Polk County Democrat.
Great. Let's talk about that work. So we talked that you were working pretty much the whole time you were at the Florida State University and had some good employment there. We didn't actually get into any of the projects that you worked on there. So let's back up into your career a little bit in Tallahassee, working for the Tallahassee Democrat. And I know that you covered some pretty interesting events there as well, starting with the civil rights movement.
Yes, very much like my service in Washington, D.C. I picked an interesting time to be in the newspaper business there. Then was down to be in the Army, of course, in Washington. And I started off as a police reporter, which is where most big papers start their rookie reporters. But within a year or so after that, I've had a front row seat for the birth of the American Civil Rights Movement. I worked, among other things, I worked all weekdays and Saturday afternoon and evening. And when I came in to work on Saturday afternoon, I learned that there had been a lunch counter sit-in, and I'm not sure that they even had the name back then, but a group of FSU and Florida A&M students had marched literally arm in arm down Monroe Street and gone into into one of the downtown department stores. I think it was a Woolworths, but I'm not sure of that, to stage a sit-in to try to get fed at the lunch counter. And the lunch counter, of course, immediately shut it down, and the police arrested them. I was not there for at the time of the demonstration, but I was later in the day, talked to some of the people who had been arrested and just generally got a feel for it. And I had the feeling then that even though as a reporter you tend to sort of take things with a grain of salt, and what seems like today's very exciting story, a week later there's some other exciting story that's gone away. And I had the feeling then, this just doesn't feel like just another event.
Interesting.
It feels like this is the start of something big, and heaven knows how big, only history has shown how big. Then another day I was working at the Democrat, and the Freedom Riders, a bunch of clergymen, black, white, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, rode in on one or more buses, may have been two, may have been just one. There were two bus stations, Greyhound and Trailways, across the street from each other. And they rode in there, sat down to be served lunch. Well, I think it was state attorney, somebody in law enforcement, checked their tickets, and the ones who had tickets showing that they were in interstate travel were allowed to eat there. But this is one of the things that's always amused me. The bus station was not going to have their white waitresses wait on this integrated group of clergy. And so they sent out a young fella. What he was doing, not being in school, I don't know, because he couldn't have been more than probably 12 years old, plus or minus a couple of years. And they sent him out to take the orders. It was sort of an in-your-face thing. You know, we may have to serve you, but we're not going to send out our white waitresses to wait on you.
Wow.
And he went out, and I've often said, if he could have done it, I think that poor young fellow would have turned white. I mean, he was scared to death.
Oh my
and
goodness
I'm sure
gracious.
Had no idea what his place in history was. And I've often wondered what happened to him as he grew up, if he realized that he had been on the front row of the American Civil Rights movement. But then after that, I think they ate at both bus stations. I know they ate at one. And then they went out to the to the Tallahassee Municipal Airport, which was relatively new, and it had one of the nicer restaurants in Tallahassee at that time. They went out to the restaurant only to be told that there had been some failure of equipment there, and that the restaurant had been closed. And that little act of fiction remained, as I recall, for several weeks before the city quietly, it was a city-owned airport, the city quietly reopened the airport.
I am so glad you decided to choose a career in journalism. You have been at the forefront of so many significant events, and you have such an insightful story about these events that occurred.
I picked the right time and the right place.
You did. You absolutely did. And to have these impressions about these immensely important happenings in our country and in our state. And even with that, so 1964, you find yourself as managing editor of the Democrat.
Right.
So I want to know, what is the biggest story of your career?
Biggest story of my career, and also the biggest story of my lifetime, is the integration of racial integration of society, and in particular the school system. Today, you tell your children, and especially your grandchildren, that you went to segregated schools and that you went to segregated facilities, bus stations and whatever. They look at you like, you know, what kind of Nathaniel are you? But at that time, I said many times,
Children.
we didn't hate each other, we didn't know each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the whites had white schools and the blacks had black schools, and we really never asked why. It's because we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
And so I was back from the Army, and I can't remember the year when the Supreme Court got serious about enforcing the Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas school integration case, because the schools throughout the South, for the most part, delayed compliance for as long as possible. But finally reached the point, okay guys, this is it. You've got to integrate the school system.
Right.
And the schools were integrated peacefully. And for that I give a great deal of credit, well, to two things. One was there were a lot of people of both races that were determined to see it happen that way.
Right.
And Dad was a member of a biracial committee, and I can still remember I got the mail, sort of the mail in those days, and I would get a postcard addressed to Dad periodically, and it would say, "The group will meet at such and such a time and place. Please be present and on time."
Oh, gee.
And that group, which had no other name, was a group of community leaders, both black and white, who were working together for racial peace as integration came. And then James Stevens, Professor Stevens, was a principal of Union Academy, which was at that time a 12-year school,
Right.
grades 1 through 12. And he sort of ruled that school with an iron hand. I mean, his word was law. And he was very good at preparing the students and the faculty and members of the community, including me, sitting down with them saying, this is what's going to happen. Here are the areas of possible problems that I see when we go from segregated to integrated school system. J.J. Corbett was a member of the faculty at Union Academy, and he was one of the first, possibly the very first Union Academy teacher to volunteer or apply to go to a white school.
Oh, wow.
And J.J. is the most easygoing person you could ever hope to find.
Indeed.
And between Professor Stevens' influence on his students and J.J. Corbett's influence being on the front lines of integration, I think that those two men probably more than anybody else deserve credit for the peaceful integration of the Bartow school system.
And wonderful. There again, there you are at the forefront.
Right.
At least hearing these conversations going on from your father's involvement with the group.
Right.
I love that. Another story that we read about is something very memorable to you has to do with Homeland Elementary School.
Yes, the Homeland at that time had, the community of Homeland had the oldest standing schoolhouse in Polk County, not active schoolhouse. It was being used as a workshop at that time by the school maintenance program. But the school was the oldest school building still in existence in Polk County. And our school board reporter came back one night from school board meeting, and she was mad as a proverbial old wet hen. I never knew how mad an old wet hen was, but when Sally Miller came back, she was just really beside herself. She said, "You don't believe what the school board's going to do. They're going to sell the Homeland Schoolhouse property, or the Homeland School, which is on a parcel of several acres, which becomes important." So, but not only were they going to do it, they had it on the consent agenda. And consent agendas are a place where governments theoretically place non-controversial items that don't need to be discussed. Consent agendas are misused. I do not like consent agendas for exactly that reason, because they often Well, yes, often I will stick with that word, are used to try to slip something past the public by saying, okay, I move we approve the 37 items on the consent agenda, and that's it. Well, the sale of the Homeland School property was on the consent agenda. And she was mad. She said, oh, they'll do that over my dead body. I said, Sally, calm down. It'll be two dead bodies, yours and mine together. So we ran a story on it saying that the school board was about to do this and done it in such a way that there would be no public hearing or opportunity for public input. And then the school board said, oh no, we're not going to sell the school, we're just going to sell the entire property around it, the several acres of vacant land. And she came back after that meeting, and once again, over my dead body, I said, Sally, there'll still be two dead bodies before they did that. Long story short, that piece of property is now the Homeland Heritage Park. It has an old church building at which a number of churches from Bartow still hold services once or twice a year. It has a pole barn, has some early, I believe there's a log cabin out there, and some early architecture which has been moved into the property there, and has become a major pull for people who are interested in historic stuff. They have a storytelling festival out there once a year which draws several hundred youngsters.
Right.
They've had parent-child, like mother-son, father-daughter camping trips out there, and it's become a real focal point not only for the community of Homeland but for a lot of Polk County. And all this was done because our reporter read over the consent agenda, realized what was happening, and blew the whistle.
Well, I thank you. I'm glad you're alive and well, and you didn't have to be one of the two dead bodies, but thank you for your influence, because it is a very special heritage site, and one that's certainly near and dear to my heart that you had some influence over was the Old Courthouse. Tell us about that. What was going on there?
Yes, the courthouse, this one that was the headquarters of all of county government back in my young childhood. Like all old buildings, got to need a lot of maintenance. Several new, at that time, additional buildings had been built for the court system. The Hall of Justice building on North Broadway, which is now part of the sheriff's office. A building on North Broadway, just north of Main Street, was either built or bought, I cannot remember which, for the county commission headquarters. The county, under the laws at that time, I don't know if it's still the case, county commission was required to furnish school board headquarters, not to build the schools, but to furnish the school board headquarters. So the county had a chance to buy the IMC phosphate headquarters on South Floral Avenue, which to this day is still the headquarters of the school board, although it has been expanded many, many times. So there was the school board of the courthouse, as you know, is right in the middle of town at the premier location, intersection of the main north-south drag and the main east-west drag, main Broadway and Main Street, and there was a certain amount of thought that the building should be torn down and paved over as a parking lot. Well, a lot of people who loved history, and Bud Dixon gets some major credit for this, put their foot down and just said, no way.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, that building has been extensively renovated. It's now a beautiful building and is the home of the Polk County History Center, which is an expansion of what was at one time the Historical and Genealogical Library. It's now a first-class museum.
Thank you very much again for your influence, using the pen to accomplish important things in the community. We've talked a lot about your career and all the wonderful things you've accomplished. You have a lovely family, so let's kind of quickly go through that. You have a wife, and you all met somewhere.
Yeah, we met at Tallahassee in the offices of the Tallahassee Democrat. I was working there. And Mary was a proofreader for the Florida State University newspaper, the FSU Flambeau, and she and several other students, all girls I think, all girls I'm quite sure, were most of them very attractive, worked in the at the Democrat as proofreaders, working on the FSU newspaper. And a good friend of mine, a guy named Orville Jackson, he and I were standing together in the Tallahassee Democrat newsroom, and he said, "You know, that Mary Grossenbach is a really pretty girl." And I looked at her, I said, "Yeah, you know she is. I'm going to ask her out." And so about a year after that, we got married. She was a year behind me in school, so after she graduated from FSU, and while I was in the Army, we got married, and we now have 3 children, one of whom is a teacher at Bartow High School for 30+ years, and one is a computer whiz and data whiz at Palette One, and the other one is currently selling real estate, but he has a degree, a divinity degree, an MDiv degree, and has worked in the ministry in the past as a counselor and may return to that field. And then we have 6 grandchildren, 2 in Lakeland and 4 in Gainesville, and we don't have enough time for me to tell you about all 6 of my grandchildren.
I know, because they're so perfect in every way, right?
Oh, absolutely. At least to their grandparents.
I can't not include in this interview some of the wonderful things you've done for the community. So let's talk a little bit about your civic involvement, some of your commitments to. I know one of them is Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, because I have the pleasure and joy of attending there with you, but also, but I think it's really important, you've been there for how many years?
Been
at Holy Trinity for?
At Holy Trinity, well, since we got I say we, anybody who's been in the Army understands that it's a we, it's not an I situation. When Mary and I got out of the Army in 1964, we came home and started attending Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. I've been members there ever since. And
I know this about you, you served as treasurer for how many years?
I could trace it back 20. I wasn't really sure. And I assure you that there is no I when it comes to being treasurer. I could not have handled that had it not been for the help of quite a number of people with skills in accounting and bookkeeping. And I sort of sat back and attended vestry meetings, and for a while I did payroll and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, there were people much more skilled in that area than I was who helped do that job.
Oh, but you did it with such heart and for such a long period of time, as is your civic club, is Rotary.
Yeah, when I got out of the Army in 1964, it was understood that if you were fortunate enough, and it is a matter of good fortune, to be involved in a business, in a management capacity in a business in Bartow, you owed it to your community to be, if you were male. This was back when almost all the business leadership was male. If you were male, you owed it to your community to be a member of Rotary, Lions, or Kiwanis, which also were all male clubs. And your employer owed you the time off with pay to take part in their activities. And if you were fortunate, your employer would even pay your dues for those organizations. And it was simply the paradigm back then, a paradigm of service, that that's what you owe your community in return for the privilege of being able to do business at a managerial level in this community. That, unfortunately, is no longer the case. There have been some good things that have happened. Civic clubs are now co-ed, and as is the business community. But that paradigm of service, for the most part, civic clubs are made up of middle-aged to late middle-aged. I'm 79. I consider myself to be late middle-aged people, and it is no longer a paradigm of service, certainly not to the extent that it was in 1964.
I agree. Communities are stronger when people are actually involved and committed to the betterment of the area through their skills and talents and resources. And I know another area that I appreciate so much is that you've had a long-term commitment to service on the Polk County Historical Association. You've also served as a commissioner on the Polk County Historical Commission, and I just want to say how much I appreciate that. And then also to your career, you are past president and life member of your professional association. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. I am proud of that. I was, after we sold the Democrat, we kept it in the family for 75 years, and after we sold it, I was made a life member of the Florida Press Association. I was a past president of Florida Press, and then a year or two later, I was inducted into the Florida Newspaper Hall of Fame, and it was I was very proud of that.
Yeah.
I'd been active in the Press Association for many, many years, as had most of the newspaper publishers in the state, and it was nice to gain that recognition.
SL, this has been such a joy for me. You definitely have such a rich and full life, and you have participated in some very significant events during your career. I know your family, you have a lovely family. I've had the good fortune to serve with you on some of the historical associations, and I appreciate so much this opportunity. And I wonder, did I miss anything? Anything on your mind that you want to share with us that I forgot to ask?
I can't really imagine what, except to tell you that I appreciate those kind words, and I assure you, service is a privilege, and that's and so I don't try to spend too much time patting myself on the back. It's a privilege that we owe to our community for what the community has done for us, and certainly this community has provided a good living and a lot of satisfaction for my family and me over the years.
And we thank you so much for that service, and we thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for the opportunity to do so.
All right. And thank you for participating with us and sharing the story of S.L. Frisbie, who is our inductee into the Polk Pioneers. Thank you.